3, 2, 1, clap. My friends used to call me the Exorcist, because whenever I came to their house, I made the spirits disappear. Do-do-do-do-do-do. Ah. Brothers, sisters, comrades and friends, welcome to Bat Country. Okay, settle in. Just before Christmas in 2018, I went missing. By then, I'd already had stuttering bits of sobriety here and there. And like everyone who's earned 1 or 2 weeks of sobriety, I thought I'd got it beat. Thought I'd figured it out. A fortnight without alcohol made me feel like it was all behind me, like I'd solved my problems and was tired of everybody talking about it and was ready to move on. I thought that I knew everything there was to know about being sober and about alcoholism, and I was ready to go out into the world. So I'd been staying with my parents in a very rural part of Cornwall, and I needed a new passport. It's weird how many of my worst episodes of drunkenness involve my passport in one way or another. But to get the new passport, I had to travel by train from Launceston in Cornwall all the way to Newport in Wales, which was the nearest passport office to the rural location I was staying in. I had to go up and around the coast. And it goes almost without saying that I never made it to Newport. In fact, I never got past Plymouth, which is, if you're unfamiliar with the geography, is the very first change that I had to make. It was the first leg of the journey. Somehow, I'd got on the early train in Cornwall, sober and prepared, and 2 hours later, when I arrived in Plymouth, I was blackout drunk. To this day, I don't know what happened. I only have fragments of memories. And none of it makes sense. None of those memories are coherent. I'm not able to kind of replay the tape in my head and figure out retroactively what occurred. And there are no real clues to help me piece it together. I don't have those breadcrumbs. I don't know. I remember falling off of a stool in a pizzeria and hitting my head on the floor. And I remember eating ice cream behind a shop next to the bins. I was squatting down on the floor, and I remember vomiting very heavily immediately afterwards. I had a pot of ice cream in one hand, and I was scooping it into my mouth and then drinking cheap vodka, Popov or something, with the other. And that's the other memory that I have. And the final memory is of the police at the door of my cheap hotel room. They had come, I remember, to kick me out. The staff had not been able to make me leave. And I'd been there several days. I don't know how many. And every morning, or at some point every day, I had gone down to reception to ask for an extension. One more day, one more day, one more day. Purely so I think I could drink myself into oblivion in that cheap, anonymous hotel room. And I remember the police. There were 2 of them. There was a kind of very broad-shouldered, grey-haired man, a real cop-looking cop, very cop-like, if you know what I mean. Very serious, unsmiling face, a very severe haircut. And there was a female officer who I remember was constantly on the phone to someone. She was holding back. She was a little further back and kind of half around a corner. And at some point during the interaction, as they tried to remove me from the room, I became belligerent and aggressive. And I squared up to the very cop-like cop. I was bigger than he was. And I squared up and I stared into his eyes. And I remember he said, "Okay." And he spun me around and he twisted my arm up my back so badly that he dislocated my shoulder. It's still not right now. What's that, 6 years later, something like that. But I didn't feel it at the time because I was smashed. I was on a public bender in this anonymous hotel room. But I do remember, while I didn't feel the pain, I do remember the female officer poking her head around the corner and getting his attention while he was pinning me to the wall. And she said, John, no, while she was on the phone. And as a result, he kind of released the pressure slightly. And then she looked at me while she was on the phone and she said, is your name Stuart? Stuart Nugent? And with my face pressed against the wall, I kind of nodded. Still with the phone to her ear, she said, do you know where you are, Stuart? And I thought for a moment and I said, Newport. And she said, no, we're in Plymouth. And the fact that she corrected me didn't mean anything to me. Where we were, I didn't know. I legitimately didn't know where we were. I didn't know what day it was. I didn't know what time of day it was. I'm surprised, in fact, that I even responded to my own name. And they didn't arrest me that time. But instead, they took me to the local police station in Plymouth. And while I was waiting to be loaded into the van, I remember her again, still on the phone. She'd walked in front of the van. And I remember her saying, I've got good news. We found him. He's a bit of a mess, but he's okay. It was something like that, paraphrasing slightly. But I distinctly remember her saying, we found him. And that struck me as odd, because I didn't know anyone was looking for me. So it turns out, pretty quickly after I failed to check in with my parents when I arrived in Plymouth, they had immediately reported me as a missing person. And normally, the police won't do anything for 24 hours, especially not if you're an adult. But they had learned from their previous mistakes, because this had happened before. And they were quick to add when they spoke to the police that he has a brain injury, he has a head injury. When you say that and you add something like they might be disoriented or they might be confused, then suddenly it becomes kind of a 5-alarm fire, and the police will really put their back into it. You don't need 24 hours for that. And that's a little backcountry tip for you. If an adult that you care about has gone missing, especially an addict, when you speak to the police, mention that they have a head injury. Anyway, I got home, sobered up, and eventually I checked my social media, and it had exploded. Hundreds of messages and mentions and comments, and people were talking about me. Because what I didn't know was that my parents, when they had reported me missing, had also put out some requests for information on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and stuff. But also I had made the national news and made the BBC, and everybody had been looking for me. Everybody now knew that I was a vulnerable person, lost somewhere in the city, somewhere in England. And everybody had mobilized. And it was daunting. Seeing that response while I'm still going through withdrawal from this particular binge, and seeing the trouble and the concern that I had caused. Being able to see it almost live, being able to scroll back through the feeds, scroll back through the news, and seeing the story and people mentioning on the local Plymouth News posted a story about me where the comments were live, and I was able to scroll back through them, and people were saying, actually, I just saw this guy, he was by the cathedral, he looks like he was worse for wear. I am, after all, quite distinctive. People do tend to remember, and they were right. It really was me. And that stuff, being reported as a missing person, being so publicly in relapse, having so many people on social media talking about me, all school friends that I haven't seen for 15 or 20 years, all suddenly this is their first impression of of me after all this time. All of that was embarrassing. But that's all it was. And I can deal with embarrassment. I've been selling dildos for 20 years now. I'm a very difficult person to embarrass. What sticks with me from that episode is this. In the days that I was missing, my mum had gone to her local church, who had organised the community, very small farming community, and they had prayed for me. And I know there are quite a lot of Americans in the audience, and that might not sound unusual to you. In fact, it might sound a very reasonable response. But my parents had disavowed religion decades ago, even before I was born, long before I was born. They had done so actively and deliberately, for reasons that you would understand if they were to tell you, if they were to explain why they made that decision. You might not agree, but you would certainly understand what led them to it. They are not religious people. And the knowledge then that I drove my mother into a church to pray for me is almost insurmountably heartbreaking. If I had contracted a fatal disease, for example, if I had to go to them and say, I have this disease and I'm going to die, I don't think they would pray for me. That wouldn't drive them into the church. A fatal disease is, after all, definitive. And what my alcoholism was putting them through was uncertainty, fear, powerlessness, hopelessness. And with alcoholism, that's what your loved ones have. That's all they have. They have no certainty. They have uncertainty and fear. And that is exhausting. And it takes a toll very quickly. Now, why do I mention that anecdote? Certainly not because it brings me any pleasure to tell you that. It was embarrassing. And as hard as I am to embarrass, I recognize that situation for what it was. It was humbling. And I tell you it because most of us who have managed to climb our way out of the bottle after a long period of alcoholism can often devote a lot of time to talking about what the worst part of alcoholism is. It's one of our favorite things to do, is to try to identify what the worst part of it is. And when we're asked about the worst part of our alcoholism, it's easy to bring up some rock bottom spent drying out in jail after getting arrested for getting your dick out in public, or waking up in hospital for an accident that you don't even remember having. All of those low points, they count as the worst part of alcoholism. But over time, I've come to realize that for me, the worst of my experience of alcoholism was actually not my experience. It was everybody else's experience of my alcoholism. It was the effect I was having on everybody around me. All the arrests, all the hospitals, all the lost opportunities, the lost work, the lost time, lost friends, all of that stuff, that's on me. That's on me to deal with. I can deal with that stuff. But the thing that puts a knot of shame and guilt and remorse in my stomach is imagining just how confused and scared and helpless everybody around me must have felt as they watched me descend into a catastrophic binge. The feeling of being a burden to people who cared about me, and the knowledge that my behavior aged people. It put them through so much stress that I could see it on their faces afterwards. There's my girlfriend, who had to walk me out of more than one serious relapses. And having to deal with her own trauma as a result. And I have a burden of guilt knowing that quite a lot of what I imagine she talks about in therapy is probably as a result of my behavior during those relapses. And then my family, who had to watch from a distance, absolutely powerless to help or to intervene, even though it was every instinct in their body was telling them to do something. There was nothing they could possibly do to assist. And there was my boss, who was also my friend. And my alcoholism repeatedly put him in positions of having to defend me to his own boss. In the end, my behavior ended that friendship and that working relationship. It will never recover from it. And he had to do it over and over again. And there were my friends who repeatedly had to call in welfare checks on me. Some of them had my address. Those who knew that I was an alcoholic had my home address if there was an emergency or a relapse. And even social media followers. For example, if I would put something suicidal or vaguely self-harmy, some kind of cry for help on social media, which I did more than once, those complete strangers often felt compelled to worry and to find ways to help too. All of these people incredibly close to me and people I've never met, were all impacted by my decision to stuff every cavity in my body with ethanol. Alcoholism is a selfish condition. But that selfishness puts an enormous strain on everybody else, both on a micro and a macro level. Alcoholism is a sickness, but it's also a massive burden. And when I'm drinking, I am unstable, to say the very least, and my mood can swing between very affectionate and very loving to anger via depression very quickly. And that can make my girlfriend feel like she has to walk on eggshells. And you don't turn that off and on. Once I'm out of the relapse, my girlfriend will still not be comfortable for weeks or months. That I'm never going to make her go through it again. And alcoholics, including unfortunately me, are manipulative too. Living with an alcoholic is exhausting. You're tired all the time. And an alcoholic can use that to make you feel like you are in the wrong, to make you feel like the situation is your fault, because you're too tired to argue. And the gaslighting is so done with such confidence that it can wear you down until you believe that the alcoholic is right. And living with an alcoholic is like living with a volcano that's trying to convince you it's a mountain. It could cause chaos at any moment while it's pretending that everything is fine. And only the slightest change in pressure will be enough to set it off. So spouses and families are really on the front line. And I guarantee you, if you're a long-term alcoholic with a spouse or with an existing relationship with your family, I can promise you that at some point behind your back, they have discussed cutting you off. My family did. They came very close. And I would have been heartbroken and angry and resentful at the time. But looking back, I wouldn't have blamed them if they did. And in fact, I'm still to this day surprised that they didn't. But they're not the only victims. They're just the most immediate victims. Alcoholism is a cluster bomb, and it does collateral damage everywhere to everyone around you. And I have another horrible story. I don't think I'll say it now. I think I'll save it for another video, but it's about the day I returned to work, right after a relapse had ended. In fact, I was still withdrawing the day that I walked in. And when I walked in, I was not met with the warm support and happiness of my colleagues to see me, but instead with looks of horror and fear and surprise. Because while I'd been in relapse, while I'd been drinking, by then the secret was out, and they knew that I had been told to stay away. And then one day in a break of the drinking, I decided that I would just go in and pretend like nothing had ever happened. And I won't tell the whole story now, but my manager then took me to one side and she told me to go back home. What a depressing day that was. I'll tell you about it another time. If for some reason you enjoy my most depressing stories, make sure you subscribe to be bummed out by that absolute bummer of a story. The point is, the reason I mention that is that the collateral damage doesn't just affect loved ones, it's also colleagues. You see, for every day that you're absent, when you don't show up to anywhere you're supposed to show up, you give all of your colleagues extra responsibilities. They have to take up the slack on your behalf, and you make everybody's life that little bit worse as a result. And then there is the damage that's just done by lying. And I've done this many times before over the course of my alcoholism and my relapse and sobriety cycles. And I remember, again, a work-related one, but I remember having a blackout binge in Croatia and lying about it to somebody who knew more about what I had done than I did. I had a week-long period where I didn't remember anything, but the person that I was speaking to did know what I had done in that week. And I was lying to their face, making stuff up on the spot to justify my absence and my behavior, even though they already knew what I had done. And I remember that particular guy had the dignity not to throw it in my face that day. And then, of course, another element of being a burden in alcoholism is the financial side, the money. And again, there is micro and macro levels to the financial side of alcoholism. Because on the one side, when you're hammered, you're not earning. And that puts pressure. If you're living with somebody, that's going to put pressure on them. And everybody who cares about you. And then the other side is that when you're drinking heavily, you're just bad with money anyway. Every time I drank, I would just lose bank cards, lose cash, huge amounts of it as well. I would withdraw like 400 euros and then it would just be gone in the morning. Maybe someone took it out of my pocket when I fell asleep in a park bench on the way home, that kind of thing. I made myself very vulnerable and just frittered money away all the time, above and beyond the cost of the alcohol itself. Because you're so reckless and irresponsible with money as an alcoholic, quite a lot of the time, loved ones are having to bail you out, both literally out of jail, but also kind of figuratively, when you get stranded in places and you can't get home, or an emergency happens while you're drinking, and you can't drive, and you have no money on you, so you need somebody else to call a taxi on your behalf and find a way to pay for it. It's always your loved ones who are going to carry that weight, that financial weight. And if you're one of those people in the comments that I see from time to time who can't wait to tell us all how no one cares about you, so this kind of problem doesn't affect you, then I would like to tell you that, first of all, stop with the self-pity. We do care about you. And second, that there is a dollar value attached to your alcoholism. Whether you think you're affecting nobody at all, whether you truly believe that no one cares about you at all, there is a dollar value attached to your drinking, and we're all paying it. Unless you're a hermit who lives in a hut that you built yourself on land that you own, and you're drinking moonshine that you made in a barrel out the back out of rainwater and twigs, and you never seek medical treatment or anything like that, unless you're one of those people, then you're costing somebody somewhere. And also, if you are that hermit, how the fuck are you watching YouTube? Okay, let's talk about the social burden of alcoholism, especially with reference to finance. Collectively, alcohol-related harm costs the global economy over $1 trillion per year. $1 trillion per year. And that's through healthcare and injury and accident and decreased productivity and law enforcement and judicial procedures. It costs globally $1 trillion. And framed differently, the CDC estimates that every single drink, every alcoholic drink that's consumed creates $2.05 in costs to society. Every drink costs society slightly more than $2, because we're all paying for the healthcare, we're all paying for the legal systems, we're all paying for the injuries and the decreasing productivity as a result of that drink. I hate being a burden at the best of times. I think it's a British thing, but it's more than that too. I think it's pretty common. My girlfriend is Finnish, and she also shares this we don't want to be an inconvenience to people. I think that's true in most places. Apart from Germany, in my experience, they are quite happy to be a burden if they need something done. But particularly people in England and Ireland, we hate being a burden to people. It's absolutely ingrained in our culture to not impose on people. On an individual basis, I'm well aware of Britain's history of imposing itself on other nations, but on an individual basis, it feels very uncomfortable to be thought of as an inconvenience. And I wonder if you have that too. I wonder if you don't like to be a burden. And for a lot of us, if it's true of you, I think that's part of why we're reluctant to seek help for alcoholism. It's because it requires that we are cared for, and that makes us a burden. Some of us have a resistance to that, I think. And there's also a factor that self-hatred is a major component of alcoholism, this kind of directionless self-hatred. We don't really know why we hate ourselves. So we kind of create reasons for ourselves. We give ourselves a reason to hate ourselves by pushing people away and by being miserable and by making people angry at us to make us feel like we deserve it. We create reasons and we feel bad and we don't know why. So we manufacture reasons to make everybody else feel bad too, just through our selfishness. And it makes me sick to think what I put people through, people who care about me. Like I said, I don't embarrass easily. So I can deal with the embarrassment, and I'm not particularly embarrassed by my behavior. I don't think embarrassment is quite the right word. But the process of becoming sober, it endows us with a lot of empathy for each other. Sobriety it gives you empathy. It makes you able to understand other people's feelings better. As you analyze your own, you begin to understand other people better. And that's a wonderful gift, but the flip side of that gift is now I can really understand the suffering that other people went through on my behalf. I almost wish sometimes that I could turn that feeling off, turn off that sense of empathy, that sense of pathos. But another part of getting sober is reckoning with those kinds of realizations and letting them be. Thank you for watching, and as always, good luck out there.